Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the second Bushfire Resilience webinar, How to Harden an Existing Home. This series of presentations has been organised by Bushfire Resilience Incorporated, an independent, not-for-profit association focused on improving community awareness and preparedness for the threat of bushfire. These webinars have been organised on the lands of the Wurundjeri people, and I wish to acknowledge them as traditional owners and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and the elders of other communities who may be joining us today. My name's Malcolm Hackett, and I'm the chair of the board of Valley Community Financial Services, the community company which owns and operates the 5 local Bendigo Community Bank branches. Like other community banks, we are a for-profit social enterprise, which returns up to 80% of our profit through community strengthening sponsorships back to the communities which support the branches. While we support all community groups, CFA brigades have been particularly important recipients because they feed directly into community resilience. State government funding is never enough, and local brigades do their best to raise funds from their communities. Over the years, our community bank branches have provided hundreds of thousands of dollars to support CFA brigades in our area. In 2007, we supported Diamond Creek Brigade with $20,000 to buy a quick fill pump. It was against CFA policy, and we helped negotiate permission to purchase the pump, which proved invaluable when the Black Saturday fires arrived. In 2008, we contributed $37,000 to Hurstbridge Brigade to purchase a generator capable of running the new station if the power went down. In a blackout, it was also pretty useful for opening the electric doors so the trucks could get out. In 2009, we contributed $22,000 for a generator that provides auxiliary power to the fire observation cabin atop the Kangaroo Ground Tower. It runs the equipment and the air conditioning if the mains fail. We've contributed $20,000 to purchase of a command vehicle for the Lower Yarra group of brigades, $12,000 for a slip-on in Kinglake West, $10,000 for a slip-on in research, $7,500 towards a control vehicle in Panton Hill, and so on. We've provided funds for smoke machines and infrared scanners, equine recovery equipment, communications gear, and all sorts of power equipment. Just last month, we helped with funds to establish the first public access defibrillator placed on the wall outside the Diamond Creek CFA. I suspect that you get the picture. Our local community banks have made a big difference to the aspirations and the effectiveness of our local brigades. We're proud to sponsor them and to contribute to this innovative webinar series. Thank you for registering your interest and for submitting your questions in advance. You'll be able to ask questions as we proceed using the Q&A function. Please keep your questions short and to the point. And if we don't get through all the questions, Justin will attempt to answer them perhaps direct with the individuals. These webinars are being recorded, and everyone who's registered will be sent the link. Please note that the webinars and the presenters are providing information, not advice. Our intention is to provide information about bushfire threat and property preparation, but it's your responsibility to seek advice for your particular situation. In this webinar, we're going to hear from Justin Leonard about how to harden an existing home. Justin is a highly regarded researcher from the CSIRO who has spent the last 26 years building his knowledge on how bushfires interact with buildings. Justin's first session on how houses are destroyed by fire was very well received, and we're grateful for this further contribution. Justin will present for 20 minutes and then we'll take questions for 20 minutes. followed by a further 20-minute presentation, and then more questions. Over to you, Justin.
Thank you very much, Malcolm. I'll just share my PowerPoint slides, and that'll guide me through this very interesting topic that I've spent roughly 26 years delving into the nooks and crannies of how to improve our houses in the wake of bushfires. In terms of a bushfire itself, we do a unique thing and actually study bushfires from the perspective of the house. So what is it like to experience a bushfire from the house's perspective? And I guess once you put that lens on, you start to imagine what experiential processes this house will experience, and what are the mechanisms and processes of how it might respond to those things. And I guess it's as you look into it, it's a far more complex set of actions and processes than simply a fire front turning up and spraying some embers around. There's so many extra nuances around the specific location of the house and its proximity to other what typically are non-bushfire elements that either play roles as barriers or as additional fuel sources in those environments. And I'm going to focus on all those processes and how to harden a house and prepare its surroundings to eliminate the potential negative impacts of those other processes. Now, if we list these processes out, this is a fairly good profile of what we're up against. Ember attack, debris accumulation, which happens over the months and years building up to a bushfire, surface fire, which is the low-level surface fuels that are burnt out when fire fronts arrive and are helped and ignited and reignited by embers. Consequential fire might be a new term you haven't heard before, but it's the term we use to describe heavy fuel elements that burn near houses and present an additional heat load, might be radiant heat or flame contact, or it might challenge someone's ability to leave a burning house. But a consequential fire is all what we call heavy fuels, and that might be a vehicle or a fence or a retaining wall or even a wheelie bin. So consequential fire is a very important aspect of preparing a home or having a home adequately built to resist. Radiant heat is what we all come to know and understand. Radiant heat from a fire front some distance away. The flame front and its ability to contact the house. Wind action, which is a very important process that's almost ubiquitous in bushfires, where these winds can directly act on the house and weaken them, and of course tree strike. So I've actually listed them in a deliberate order from the ones that are most prevalent in causing structural loss through to the ones that are least prevalent. So this gives us a bit of a guide to move from through a list from the most crucial things to begin and address first, and move further and further down the list to the lesser important ones. But of course, for all circumstances, I'd strongly encourage you to work through the entire list. So in terms of the process of trying to unpack how do we solve each of these actions, it's important to recognize that they're not all created equal in terms of the best way to approach them. And what I've put up here is a profile of whether a particular attack mechanism is easier to resolve through house design and upgrade or modification, or it's more easily addressed through landscaping and removal of it as an action on the house. Now, if we move through these, it becomes fairly clear. Ember attack, which is quite a prolific process in the landscape, and embers are spraying everywhere in a bushfire context, it's almost impossible to imagine that we could eliminate ember attack by clearing enough vegetation and enough sources of embers. It's just simply not a practical process to go for elimination from a landscape approach. However, solving it from a house design perspective is relatively straightforward. So that's why we have an X leaning well over against the house side of the process. Conversely, if we look at something like tree strike at the bottom of the list here, you could imagine that designing a house strong enough to withstand tree strike is near impossible. However, managing the trees and providing a sufficient buffer by managing the trees in the landscape side of the process is relatively straightforward. So this just gives us a nice handy guide, and I'll come back to this a few times throughout the presentation. Now let's start by also considering that these attack processes are obviously very important for house survival, but they're actually absolutely critical for occupant survival. So not only is a house potentially experiencing all of these processes, but an occupant, if they're forced to leave their house during a fire event, because the house may actually ignite and start to burn down, will be faced with these very same actions. So we have to think that we're doing these mitigation processes both for the house's benefit, but also to make an improvement in the potential for occupant survival. And this graph is one of my favorite graphs to display how, as we move through the categories of fire weather severity, how the potential for life and house loss escalates. So one of these profiles is life loss and the other one is house loss, ranging from 0 to 100% of all the loss that we've studied across the history of Australian fires. So we can see that the context of actually planning and preparing our houses for the pointy end of this process up around the extreme in code red is particularly important. Therefore, having those types of fire weather severity in mind when we're planning and upgrading our house and modifying our landscape, it really needs to be able to perform and be effective under those categories when the winds are very severe, the landscapes are very dry, and the fires are very aggressive. The other important context to focus on is that of the people that lost their lives outside, so not with the benefit of their house, either because the house burnt down and they were forced out to try and survive outside, or they were trying to get back to their house, or they were in the process of defending their house and weren't able to make it back inside, the vast majority, well over 60% of the people that died outside anywhere in Australia, were no more than 100 meters from their own house. That's not any house, it's their own house. And which really helps us focus this on this idea that not only the house's survival, but the landscape immediately around the house is critical in contributing to your prospects of surviving a fire. Now, this isn't to negate the idea that we shouldn't be anywhere near a bushfire prone area while one of these fires is active in your landscape. But in the event that those processes and plans didn't unfold the right way, you have the fallback plan of potentially a well-designed house and a well-prepared landscape that you could survive within if you were in the immediate surrounds of your house. This graph also highlights how approximately 80% of all fatalities outside were no further than 500 metres from your own home as well. So quite startling statistics about how important the local landscape around you is in these severe fire events. So back to the mechanisms, and we're going to address ember attack and debris accumulation first. So these two processes are predominantly focused around what we can do with the house. So when we can do a little bit with debris accumulation by removing overhanging trees, but most of our work is trying to prepare a house to be adequate to withstand ember attack and to be tolerant to some amount of debris accumulation. So photos like this show the obvious implications of adjacent and overhanging trees. And even if they're particular plants that are well considered, if they are overhanging and can deposit their debris on the structure accumulates that debris load in obvious places like the gutter lines and in the subfloor areas, but it also builds up in places that you can't see, which is under roof capping and under tiles and in roof cavities. Now, to design against this kind of approach, you would think something like sarking might be a possible approach. However, all of our conventional sarking, even the ones specified in our building standards, actually perform similarly to this, where the debris that might accumulate on top of that sarking and below your ridge line will simply burn away and allow that debris to drop further into your roof cavity during a fire event. So sarking isn't really a solution. And the most appropriate way to go is actually to think about removing, in this case, you could remove the capping and place a thin strip of fiberglass insulation batt and then screw down the ridge capping, which actually seals off, while allowing some airflow, it seals off ember access and debris access to that ridge line. There's also many other ways debris builds up and interacts with other features on our roofs. In this case, we're showing the interaction between a gutter and an overhang which has a polycarbonate roof covering. This scenario here is not of a particular issue, but it just shows you how a small source of fire can interact with such a glazing element. Now, if those glazing elements are actually fiberglass reinforced skylights, they're the ones that have a matte finish and you can sort of see fiber through those coverings. They are extremely ignitable and will in themselves carry a fire from a gutter line all the way to a house. So if these are present or used in your house, they should be removed and replaced by a polycarbonate alternative, which acts in a far more benign way because it doesn't burn in situ and carry a fire across the roof line to your house. And in fact, here's an extreme scenario where quite an aggressive fire arrived and exposed this polycarbonate covered patio area. And in each case, the polycarbonate did not burn in situ, but melted and drooped in position, but did not add any additional fuel load to the house itself. So while it does melt and droop, the risk that it presents is benign in a bushfire. And of course, there's other conventional ways to protect our gutter lines. And one of those is using gutter guards. But in the event of using a gutter guard, it's very important to firstly select ones that are not made of polymeric materials, because they simply add to the fuel load that's in your gutter. And when the embers arrive, they will melt and burn through, along with any debris that has built up on top of them. The mesh size for these gutter guards really needs to be 2 millimeters or smaller in aperture size to be effective, because embers will simply pass through larger gaps and access what debris, if any, has built up under them. And of course, the means of fixing them both to the roof and to the gutter line must be of some type of non-combustible material and flashing, so that it can perform adequately under the combined actions that bushfires bring. Of course, a house is made up of many gaps, and we need to be really diligent in reviewing where all those gaps may be that embers could enter, including the ones that are quite large and in some cases are often overlooked, like the overhead gap over a roller door. But in terms of finding gaps and understanding where they go, it's really a sort of a detective process of looking and looking and looking at your house to understand where they are and resolve them through whatever means you can. But it's really an attitude and an approach that you just have to come to terms with and observe very carefully, and look at deliberate vents that may not have small enough apertures. The 2 mil rule is absolutely relevant to every gap around your entire house. Surface fire and surface fuels are a real challenge in a bushfire event, because it's not if but when they will burn out. And when they burn out, they can provide localized flame attack for anything near them. And depending on their thickness of debris load on the ground, they can burn for many hours and provide a really significant heat load for all things at ground level. So the obvious ways to solve this are not having combustible materials immediately adjacent to the ground, and eliminating the surface fuels that come. But in a sense, the complete elimination of surface fuels doesn't completely solve the problem, because there's so much debris active in the air on these windy days. It's fairly common to observe debris build up and reaccumulation against ground elements around your house, and that ignite and then apply new flames to those events. The same goes with unprotected gutters. Yes, you can clean your gutters out, but during the fire event itself, the debris can build up again to some extent in those gutters and apply localized flame attack to the roof elements adjacent. So the really reliable approach is simply to eliminate ignitable building elements near the ground. And the height you actually need to think about is obviously dependent on the size of the pile of debris that's on the ground, but something like 1/2 metre of clearance is an effective measure to go by. The surface fires and ember attack are quite ubiquitous in what they take out near ground level. And in my previous forum, I've highlighted the issue of treated pine, which is a common timber used near and in ground contact scenarios. That burns out prolifically because when surface fires arrive and impact these structures. Moving away from the ground surface itself, there's many nooks and crannies on the attached elements that surround our house. So this decking element here actually shows how much debris has packed itself in between the decking boards and the fascia on this deck. And that is obviously provided one of the better locations for an ember to land and take hold in that fine debris and develop into a decking fire that, if left unsuppressed, would provide such a significant heat load to a house that the house itself could be taken out. How do you eliminate these? Well, it's simply not viable to have multiple timber elements contacting each other in a complex way. You have to eliminate timber elements by actually using non-combustible supporting elements under decks. And it's possible to use non-combustible supporting elements under decks and possibly use high durability timber decking boards, or even better than that, using deliberately designed wood composite decking that is rated for use in bushfire-prone areas. But the importance of having non-combustible substructures under the decks and under houses themselves is absolutely critical. Of course, the way staircases and also present re-entrant corners is ubiquitous and similar to actual decks as well. So any little nook and cranny or re-entrant corner is a critical way that these can be lost. And while that looks quite difficult to design a stair system that isn't susceptible to direct ember attack, there are quite a few accidental designs that work particularly well. And here's one we observed in the Tathra fires a few years back, where this staircase not only survived the onslaught of radiant heat and ember attack, it actually survived the complete burnout of the house it was attached to. And that's not because it was all non-combustible. In fact, it had high durability timber treads, but the decking, the stair design itself highlights how a bit of isolated timber, not connected intimately with other timber elements, can perform quite effectively because the substructure supporting it has no particular combustibility, so it can't work off each other and burn down. Now I'll leave it there and we'll go to our first break.
Thanks, Justin. You've got us off to a great start, and we're getting some really interesting questions come in. I guess you gave us a lot to think about last time, and I can see already that people are responding from some of the questions that were raised in their minds in last week. You highlighted last week the risk of roof tiles allowing embers to enter the roof structure, and we've got a question here about what are there any options to modify an existing tiled roof, or do you need to replace it to give greater protection? And I guess it's in particular, what about a fire-resistant lining under the tiles, like Firefly or something similar to that?
Yes, certainly. So that's an excellent suggestion for a way forward, and I guess it does really go straight to the point that a tiled roof needs quite a dramatic amount intervention to resolve the problem, and the problem is fundamentally because the tiles don't seal against each other, and the entire roof itself has almost a universal ember access problem. The second part of that problem is that the battens that the tiles are sitting on and secured to are timber, and in most cases the trusses that those tile battens are screwed to or nailed to are timber also. And the sarking, if it's ever fitted, is usually fitted over the framing, the A-framing, but under the tile battens, only because that is actually the only practical way a tile roofing contractor can navigate and walk over the roof without damaging the sarking. So given that that is sort of the combination of problems, using a firefly sarking would be an excellent way forward, but it must be used in combination with metal tile battens. So you put the firefly sarking over the A-frame, screw that down and secure it down with metal tile battens, and then put your tiles back on, and you can have a fairly bushfire tolerant tile roof.
Can you describe the composition of that firefly sarking?
It's a combination of foil coatings and ceramic and glass fiber, but it's essentially a non-combustible, fire-resistant sarking type material. But the important aspect of it is that it's fire-resisting. So if you ever want to determine whether your sarking's adequate or not, string it out, clamp it to a couple of sawhorses, put a big pile of leaves in the middle of it, and burn that pile of leaves on the sarking. And if it doesn't burn through the sarking, then you've got the right stuff.
Great practical suggestion. Thanks. That's fantastic. What's the probability of embers or radiant heat affecting deck tights? You know, the rubber piping that surrounds a roof opening with a pipe coming through it. And is there any way to minimise the impact?
Yeah, sure. So all deck tights aren't created equal, and you'll find that there's two types when you go into a hardware store. One is a high temperature one, which is actually designed to go around things like flues for wood heaters and gas heaters that perforate up through the roof. And they're typically a red silicon material. They're quite high temperature performing and can resist quite a bit of debris build up against them and the burning out of that debris. The other types, which are a butyl rubber style material, which can also be red or black, so be careful, will burn out readily when a small amount of debris builds up against it and burns in a bushfire.
And those deck type, those different styles, are they marked, or do you have to ask about their flammability?
Yeah, the high temperature ones will be deliberately rated and marked, and will cost significantly more. So there'll be a fair bit of enthusiastic advertising around them to try and convince you to pay the extra.
Right. Now, this person's asking the same thing that was going through my mind, with the reblocking of a roof ridge capping caused by corrugated roofing. Can you confirm that you suggested a fiberglass type bat to block the openings? This person had read, and I must admit I believed that rock wool was recommended for those sorts of things, because again, not all insulation is created equal.
Yeah, it's certainly true that rock wool and glass wool are two quite different bat materials, and that the rock wool by name means that it's actually made from a rock silica material, which has a much higher melting point than glass wool. But in that application under a roof ridge line for ember attack, both will perform adequately, because there simply isn't the heat locally to actually melt out the glass bat. So it's easy to go with the more compliant, cheaper glass bat. If you were trying to prepare a roof for flame attack and direct, like, flame zone impingement, then the rock wool option would be a preferred upgrade. Okay,
that's helpful. I might have designed my house differently if I'd known. I need to, here's a person would like to confirm the desirability of replacing full-length fiberglass reinforced skylight strips in a shed with the polycarbonate strips.
Yeah, most definitely a dramatic improvement, because the fiberglass skylights can perform a burn quite aggressively from a very small gutter fire. Um, Neither of them will offer you a complete barrier protection to the those glazing units breaching when there's significant fuel load in the gutter, but you're far better off with a polycarbonate alternative than the fiberglass.
Thanks, Justin. We might do an audience poll while we're thinking about this next one. So if you'd like to launch that, Rowan, that would be good. When I was looking at that slide of the, in fact, I'd love to know how many people were thinking this. I was looking at the slide of the garage roller door, and I'm listening to you, but I'm trying to work out now, how would I deal with that? What would I do? How am I going to, protect that opening? What's the best you've seen? Are there proprietary things you can buy? How can you go about improving that situation?
Sure. So a roller door has a couple of challenging points. The first one's the contact point where the roller door touches the ground. And the ideal thing there is to have a reasonably good high temperature silicon seal that runs along the bottom, so it comes down and contacts the ground firmly and with a flexible material that is going to stay in place even when debris burns up against it. The second place the roller door is susceptible to is up both sides, where the roller door runs in a track. And unfortunately, the tolerances in those tracks are so broad that a bit of air pressure against it will allow embers to blow around that track and allow embers to get into your garage. And the third one is the one shown in that photo, which is the massive gaps that can be at the top of your roller door when the roller door unspools and it's lowered. And the way to address that is either to have a cover, a flashing that comes down, and a nylon fire retardant brush seal that rubs against your roller door as it goes up and down. But it has to be, you end up losing a certain amount of overhead height to allow that brush seal to come in contact with the roller door that is already remaining in the track, so it doesn't go in and out. There is a better way than that to do it, and that is to work from inside your garage, and you actually box out the entire spool of roller door, box it out and put the nylon seal on the back face of your roller door at the bottom of the box. So the box actually forms a whole ember type helmet for your roller door.
Terrific. I reckon I would have got there eventually. What can you do if you've got treated pine retaining walls, say within 3 metres of the house? Is there any way you can mitigate that, or you're in trouble?
Yeah, you're certainly in trouble at that distance. And so I guess it's a question of how integral the wall already is, and whether it's really coming up for time for the treated pine elements to actually be replaced. So it's a little bit of a cost benefit implication to either replace them with the fibre reinforced concrete mock sleeper look, which is expensive but very appropriate in a bushfire and made to the same sizes as the treated pine standard sleepers. Or you need to think about some intermediate step where you might actually clad out the treated pine with AC sheet that runs over its surface across the top and for some distance down the back until you get well into the soil line. And it's only once you've completely boxed it out that there's a chance that treated pine might not get involved in a bushfire, although nothing's ever certain. But don't forget, if it does get involved in a fire, you do have a real toxic ash local load issue like I highlighted last time.
Yes.
So it's always preferred to do the change out whenever you find that appropriate.
Where are we up to? I think that we've answered most of our questions. If you'd like to start that next presentation, Justin, we'll go there. Thanks.
Sure. Oh, should we have a quick look at the poll
Oh
results?
yeah, we should. You go. Yeah.
So what are we up against? Top priorities. Fill in gaps to prevent embers entering into structure. Yep, that's definitely my pick. Yeah, yep, that's a really good profile of the relative priorities of the approach. And yeah, if you haven't, and then I guess the nice thing about the first one is it's probably one of the easiest things you can do for the best net benefit of all those processes. But of course, all those processes are relevant and worth addressing in a hierarchy of considerations. So yeah, good food for thought.
Just on that filling in gaps to prevent embers, there's no doubt. I mean, there's silicon sealers and things like that. Are there preferences there for ones that are better than others?
Yeah, silicon is a pretty good go-to gap filler, and I guess when you move on to other approaches to fill gaps, any joining strips between AC sheets and things like that are typically things like PVC joining strips. You should actually think about all of those polymer systems that attempt to join boards together as gaps as being quite likely that they may melt and fall away during those events too. So not only think about gaps that are there that you need to fill or seal, but actually gaps that can develop when a modest amount of heat is applied to your house. And I guess embers don't have a predominant direction they come at. So look at the gaps from all angles. So look up underneath the sills of windows, look along the bases of doors. And I guess your active openings are going to be one of your biggest issues to address. And there's actually quite a good range of weather seals that work on obviously around door jambs and along the bases of doors. And those active weather seals are really handy, and you can get high temperature versions of those in almost any type of seal.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Justin. Let's go then to the second part of your presentation.
Sure. So we're going to move on to, oh, we've already done surface fire, wouldn't you know? Oh no, we're moving on to surface fire. So surface fire is an issue about what really is applied to and against houses, and what is the detail of the house that comes down adjacent to those materials. There's so much debris that can build up and play against those actions. But really think about the detailing, particularly the subfloor access doorways that may be susceptible to that debris. I've seen many houses that have been very well built, but then they do a simple job of the access doorway. In this case, it's a metal one that hopefully has significant seals behind it. Those surface fires can attack stairways. And this one's a very important one to look at because the stairway itself didn't actually contact the ground. If you look to the bottom left, you can actually see that there's a metal stirrup and a certain amount of clearance between the tan bark fuel bed underneath the stairway, and that typical height that those stirrups are set at are actually not far enough to prevent direct ignition and combustion of the adjacent timber elements. The similar can be said about the typical way that poles are stirruped with a galvanized footing stirrup such as this. The typical height clearances are never enough, and at the same time, the way these are designed is quite typical to allow debris to pack in at the base of the post, but in that U-shaped stirrup. Likewise, the attack around an ember attack around decking details is also one of those really important processes to hone in on. Now, in terms of solutions, you can't really ever completely eliminate the debris buildup under a structure or against a structure, but you can think about complete non-combustible solutions. So we think about brick piers or bricking in existing timber piers, or moving to, or having all steel support posts. Now these ones are actually a securing type. There's screw-in piers and others that are placed in situ, and 3 angular pegs are driven into the ground to secure their location and support. And of course, for decking, the steel structures underneath the decking are important, as is in this case, a mod wood composite decking that was deliberately designed and tested for performance in bushfire. And of course, it has performed extremely well despite adjacent fuel loads and impacts on it. And it could actually be an effective deck to use as an egress route in a fire event. There's plenty of ground cover options, and I would encourage you to think sort of beyond the traditional tan bark and mulch approach, particularly in the few meters up to and immediately against a structure. It's absolutely critical. So please consider stone, various gravels, and compressed aggregate finishes, concrete, and also, surprisingly, a high quality artificial turf is actually a reasonable performer in bushfires. We've only found some very low quality artificial grasses that have come in, approximately a decade old to be actually a poor performer, but by and large, all the reputable brands currently on the market don't tend to perform badly in a bushfire event. And of course, think about creative garden design and plantings that simply don't provide that additional fuel load to your structure. So let's move on to consequential fires, radiant heat, and the prospect of flame front contact. So we can see that most of these are quite challenging things to solve from a house design perspective. And obviously for a consequential fire, actually removing the source of consequential fire is a lot easier than designing a house to handle the long burnout time that that a fence or a retaining wall or a car can present to the house. Radiant heat is a mix between having the prospects of removing all your radiant heat sources from the landscape versus building a house or modifying a house to be adequate for the radiant heat that's imposed. But in terms of looking into how to solve and what's an appropriate thing to build against radiant heat levels, I guess it's reasonable to say that our building standards provide a reasonable amount of guidance of appropriate materials for certain radiant heat level circumstances. And of course, AS3959 is currently a free standard, so I definitely encourage you to go and get a copy of that while it's free. Might not last forever. Flame front contact is obviously an expensive prospect to deal with direct flame front contact on a house. However, in many cases, it can be solved in the landscape, and I guess the 1030 and the 1050 rule are good examples of where a landscape approach can, by and large, eliminate most of the flame front contact prospect that a house may face. So in terms of what that clearance means, there is a few extra nuances. So we spoke about 1030 and 1050 that I introduced in our previous webinar. There's actually a lot of detail that can be wrapped around what types of vegetation clearance and selection are relevant, and what the actual metrics in the 1030 and 1050 mean. For instance, you know, at 10 meters, does 10 meters mean that you can cut down any tree within 10 meters? Well, certainly if the trunk is within 10 meters, yes, you can take the tree out, but you can also remove foliage, overhanging foliage that reaches into the 10-meter zone as well. And if you're interested in the specifics of exactly what to clear and how to clear, I'd actually encourage you to look up this particular website called environment.vic.gov.au. And in their landing page, they have a tag that says native vegetation removal regulations. And that actually delves very deeply into exactly what you can and can't do. And this is actually the front page of the document you can download for free. And it takes you into the really specifics of what's behind it. And there's a lot of very good guidance advice about the tree removal and the vegetation surface removal out to the 30 or the 50 meters. And I guess that also covers the implications and descriptions around the consideration of dead trees, which by themselves may not present a significant fuel load provided they're a significant distance away, but the way to consider trade-offs about them being habitat trees and what role they might play in limiting access or egress, or for vehicle access, for example. And it also goes into the tree and vegetation clearances along fence lines, which is another important aspect. So a very valuable document for people in bushfire-prone areas. Now, in terms of house design, the radiant heat and the consequential fire implications are endless, really. And what I'd like to highlight here is there's just so many aspects of vulnerable places on a house when you start to think about how consequential fires, which are materials, be it an adjacent house, be it gas bottles, be it stored materials, can play out on a structure. This picture here basically provides so many different combinations of issues that it's hard to do it justice. In that we've got gas bottles that are poorly secured against extreme fuel loads that the structure provides, and also even gas bottles that may be awaiting either removal or installation that are laid over in a worst case scenario where the fuel loads here are enough for that. If that gas bottle on the ground had any liquid gas left in it, that could basically go off like a bomb in this event, because gas bottles on their side cannot vent adequately and can build up pressure to the point that they detonate and take out roughly a 50 to 80 meter radius. It'll shatter windows. Other consequential fire sources, like retaining walls and whatnot, are key issues. So they more or less have to be eliminated if they're in the 0 to 3 meters. And I guess the 3 to 6 meter range is the range where you start to consider the size and particular material of the consequential fire source in combination with the adequacy of the house itself. So obviously, a masonry clad house that has no windows in it facing a consequential fire source like this isn't a particular issue, but a similar house with a window or a door in it is vulnerable. So you either have to seriously think about upgrading the window to be adequate. So we're talking about aluminium windows with toughened glass glazing elements in them, or shutters, or of course the removal of the consequential fire source. The placement of our wheelie bins in the landscape is just one of those obvious ones that for many, they're diligent and they will have a particular routine about where the wheelie bins get parked during fire, during the fire season, while others just simply don't register that as a significant fuel load. They do burn out quite prolifically, and they are enough in themselves if parked under a window or against a combustible facade to be the reason why a house is lost. The places we store our timber is an obvious one, and I guess the question is it okay during the winter when we might use it for wood heating, but how diligent are we about the complete removal of those fuel loads during the fire event itself? And of course, in a fairly built up environment, we've seen wood piles built against fences that are sufficient to take out a neighbouring property built at that normal setback of 900 millimetres from a boundary. And that can be with a non-combustible fence or with a combustible fence in place. House-to-house spread is another ubiquitous form of consequential fire. So the typical separations we see between neighbouring houses, or houses and sheds on the same property, or houses and sheds on neighbouring properties, when they're significantly less than 12 metres, say around the 6 metre range or less, then there is a high chance that one house can burn its neighbour down. Now, the things you have to do to actually resolve a house-to-house spread are things like very tall steel fences, elimination of fuel loads between those two houses, which simply add to the problem, and quite fire-resistant construction on both houses, considering the windows, the eaves, and the fascia materials, is really the types of efforts you need. So it's a really challenging mutual risk problem that many face, and ideally, having good separation is a virtue. However, when you don't, you're really in it together in a mutual risk scenario. And I guess in a way, it's a very important neighbourly conversation to have when you share a mutual risk like this. And I guess another way to address it is to simply be as diligent as each other, as the neighbour that you share the risk with, to make both properties as bushfire resistant as you can, so that you don't face anywhere near as much prospect of one house burning its neighbour down. The use of sprays and spray systems is another quite broad topic, and they can be used for many things. And I guess the best advice I can offer is that they're good for a few particular targeted things. However, I've never seen a spray system design that's particularly effective at solving all aspects of bushfire risk that, that an otherwise vulnerable house could face. There's particular spray system designs for drenching a house to withstand a neighbouring property fire. There's another quite different sprinkler design that's adequate for filling your gutters and keeping them wet during an event. There's a different type of spray system that's dedicated to keeping glass and glazing systems wet throughout an entire event and withstand quite a high radiant heat flame load. And then there's a different spray system again that might wet out a deck in an effective way. What I've seen is spray systems applied to houses in a fairly generic way with an assumption that that'll solve most of the house's problems, but in virtually all cases, that's not the case. So here's a spray system fitted to the eaves. It's spraying most of its water into the air, and under a very windy day, the vast majority of that water will not impact that house or provide any particularly useful support to protect that house. It doesn't seal any gaps. It doesn't really wet the windows out adequately in this case. And if you're lucky, it might get a little bit of water in the gutter that they're mounted just below. In a similar vein, the spray systems that are fitted to ridge lines along houses, by and large, put very little water into the gutter of the roof that they're fitted to under the really windy conditions. And if they are run with enough intensity, they might get a little bit of water in the downwind gutter, but no water at all in the upwind gutter. So I've seen, I guess the vast majority of spray systems I've seen just aren't adequate for purpose or meet the claims that they are fitted on the house to achieve. But saying that, I wouldn't discourage the use of spray systems that are specific for a purpose or a couple of purposes and designed for that process. And of course, if you're going to have a spray system, it's absolutely imperative to have a reliable source of stored water, pump, and means for that pump to operate throughout the entire fire event. This is a sort of a tongue-in-cheek picture of a very poorly specified and located tank in that it's made of fiberglass. And for the same reason why the semi-transparent clear fiberglass skylights burn out prolifically, these fiberglass half-shell water tanks burn out prolifically in fire events as well, and almost certainly do not provide adequate means to store water. And if they do rupture, and this one's highly likely to in a fire event, it can rupture in a way that can break open the house it's adjacent to. And you can actually see the typical combination of a treated pine edging making a platform that supports this fiberglass water tank. That's enough in itself as a fuel load to ensure that that tank fails in a fairly modest ember attack. Sheds and supports for water tanks are just as important in consideration. This is another tongue-in-cheek picture to say we have to be very careful about how we think and design our water tanks and what we put around them and where the pump and pumping system and supply pipes actually go. It's very easy to say, oh, I've got an enclosure now, so I'm going to store X, Y, and Z in with my pump. You really have to think about the implications and processes that may unfold in a bushfire if and when it comes. Now I'm going to talk about wind and tree strike as our final topic. Now, tree strike's a relatively easy thing to deal with, and some of the best rules of thumb I've seen is the 45-degree rule. So if you can sort of project a line out from the base of your house at 45 degrees and it looks through substantial tree canopy, well, by definition, that tree could impact your house in some way if it fell over. And that's a means to consider whether some pruning, and that's hopefully allowed within the 1030 or 1050 rule, can adequately support that. I'm not saying the 1030 and 1050 rule is adequate if the trees are significantly taller than 10 metres, but that's a reasonable rule to see whether you've got significant tree strike risk. And of course, wind implications. Now, this previous picture shows a deliberate retention of the trees in the landscape, and those retention of tall canopy trees do a lot to help moderate the potential risk of this happening, which is direct wind loads acting on your house that are so severe that it could compromise the integrity of your house or roof in a fire event. Now, the fire events that we all know all too well, like Black Saturday and Ash Wednesday, both involved wind speeds and wind gusts that were sufficient for exposed houses to be damaged directly themselves. So wind gusts that exceed 75 kilometres an hour are enough to potentially lift tin or dislodge roof tiles, or project branches through the air that could break a window. So that degree of weakening obviously then allows the other bushfire actions to play on the house and cause issues. And I guess the things that can help support or manage that risk are retain vegetation in the landscape to reduce the loads on your house itself, but also think very carefully about how adequately your roofing is fixed. An extra pack of screws on every other ridge on a roof is an excellent consideration, as is means to protect windows by putting shutters or fly screens or protective things over the window glass themselves. All help to contribute to hardening those processes. There's also good building guidance around building in cyclone areas, and I'd encourage you to look to some of those Queensland resources for ideas on how to harden up your house for those rare but particularly critical wind actions on your structure. And I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Justin. You've got me thinking again, and you certainly got a lot of people asking questions here. What we might launch our next poll, Rowan, and we'll address a couple of these questions. Justin, hang on, I've got to find it.
Here we are.
Yep. So have a go at that poll. While folk are looking at that, we've got someone here who'd like to know, will 4mm cement sheet screwed to softwood fascias help to prevent radiant heat igniting the timber? And if not, what treatment would you recommend for protecting exposed softwood?
So 4mm AC sheet is non-combustible itself, but under a modest amount of radiant heat, say something like 19 kilowatts, so Bell 19 and up, is enough to heat up the thin AC sheet, and it'll start to distort and curl at the edges. And of course, AC sheet's one of those typical sheeting that's put up and joined using a H-section join. And those joins are critical because quite often the go-to material is a PVC H joining strip between the two sheets, which really does nothing to actually keep the sheets joined effectively and prevent that lifting and peeling away and opening up of gaps between the sheets. So the way to deal with that is to move to an overlapping join approach, where you actually use multiple layers of 4mm sheet, and then you start to get into quite a reasonable performing system. The softwood framing underneath the AC sheet is vulnerable to when it reaches a temperature of approximately 180 degrees. It will char and smoke and possibly start to burn in that cavity if the AC sheet itself on the back face gets above that temperature. So the question is how much heat is on it and for how long before that AC sheet actually gets to 180 degrees. So when you think about consequential fire sources like a neighbouring house or a retaining wall or a motor vehicle, there's a high possibility that you can definitely get your facade to that. A fast-moving fire that has a fairly good separation that briefly sees 19 kilowatts, possibly you won't get to that temperature.
Okay, thank you. Do you want to have a look across at our second poll and
here we are.
Comments on that?
Top priorities for face filling gaps, roof. Yeah, so I guess I would say that roofs and the weaknesses around roofs and roof access is probably the real really one to emphasize, in that there's quite a high degree of loss implication around those roofs, and as a priority, getting your roof sorted out is a really good approach. So good to see that one second. And I guess, yeah, the broader issue of, I guess, addressing gaps in structures is also a key approach. In a sense, the roofs are a real one I would keep coming back to, in that if you happen to be in a house and trying to use it for survival, the last thing you want is it to fail via a roof failure, because one of the main challenges is that the first thing you know about your roof actually failing is when the ceiling linings start to fall in, and at that point you have, you know, fractions of minutes to safely get out of that house. Conversely, if you do have a vulnerable roof, you really need to think about ways of managing it actively during a fire, like having a really good water source near the manhole and a safe way of accessing and constantly scanning that roof cavity.
Thanks for that one. Now, here's something that I'm unfamiliar with. What's a 60-60-60 wall between a house, a shed, and is it useful?
Sure. So a 60-60-60 is a number designation that describes a fire rating, and the 60 actually refers to 60 minutes. The three numbers involved in that designation deal with integrity, and so one has to do with whether the wall will collapse in 60 minutes, whether a hole will form through it in 60 minutes, or whether the back face of the wall will exceed the magic 160, 180 degrees I was talking about for that softwood ignition within the 60 minutes. So a 60-60-60 rated wall won't fail in any of those three key ways so therefore has a reasonable chance of surviving against an adjacent consequential fire source. Now, you might be thinking that houses can burn for actually longer than an hour, and that's actually true. But what's considered, or why those fire ratings are used in commercial premises and in some cases in residential buildings, is that the fire brigade is certainly going to turn up and have a fair chance of putting that fire out during that time period. The challenge in a bushfire is, will that happen? So it's worth considering that the 60-60-60 probably works in most circumstances, but not all. The other thing is, it doesn't rule out the fact that that wall could actually be combustible. So one of the most interesting versions of a 60-60-60 wall is a thick log cabin wall. And it's fair enough, because the log cabin will take more than 60 minutes to burn completely through those thick logs. But in a bushfire context, that wall will definitely burn down eventually, and whatever's behind it will be lost unless the fire agencies turn up. So if you want to create a really adequate barrier, it should be non-combustible and 60-60-60, then you've got a fair chance.
And here's a problem. Perhaps it's a maintenance one, but certainly it's something that I've observed in our local Strathewen Hall, and that's, how do you prevent debris build-up in pebble mulch over years? This person's found that their gravel and stone mulch is actually just disappearing.
Yeah, it is a bit tricky because it does all infuse and meld into one. And I guess some of the more innovative approaches involve an old bed frame and some hard yakka with a shovel, where you actually dig it up and refilter it all through the mesh of one of those old steel bed frames or something similar to try and separate it all. But I find that most people end up sort of removing it and laying down some fresh stuff.
Yeah, perhaps a bit easier. We've got a person here who's concerned that their petrol pump is the weak link in the event that they have to defend their house. Have you got any advice about using a generator instead to maintain power and hence their water supply?
Yeah, sure. So I guess in a Black Saturday context, over 90% of the houses were lost in, 90% of the pumping systems for houses that were supplying water for active defence or spray systems failed during the peak of the event. And that was everything to do with ingestion of embers into the filter, fuel lock because the pump itself got too hot, embers and debris landing on the electrical systems and burning it out, like everything possible. Or simply the air was too hot that was ingested into the pump, and the pump simply stopped functioning either temporarily and needed to be manually restarted. So the idea of putting your pump in a protected enclosure that not only provides ember but thermal protection, so it's a cool operating location for the pump, needs a fair bit of work. But one of the ideal solutions is you can put an electric pump out there in an enclosure and protect the electrical supply and whatnot. It can actually handle quite a lot of heat and doesn't need to breathe air through it to operate. Run your cables underground to a good, safe location, in an adequate spot where you can build an enclosure or run it in a shed or something like that, and have a generator run in that remote, more viable location rather than a location right out near your water source.
That scenario you painted there, I can add to that. I had gravity-fed petrol pump from a dam. The pump functioned perfectly, but I wasn't aware that the poly pipe leading down to the pump was only 6 inches under the ground, and when the tree roots caught fire, it put holes through the poly pump, and so the supply failed. I learnt a lesson there. Lost the house, learnt the lesson.
Yeah, a lot of people actually think that water-filled polypipe will do okay because it's got water on the other side, but in fact, it prolifically fails when it's exposed to direct flame. And I guess the other angle to think about with pumps is a lot of them are supplied with enough fuel to operate for an hour, possibly two, and that's often they're connected to a water supply that can last much, much longer than that. And having that tank full in the first place is step one, but the prospects of refueling it while there's an active embers in the air isn't very exciting, particularly if it's a petrol pump. So that's another tick for the remote generator with a fairly significant sized tank, or it's in a relatively protected environment that you can safely refuel it.
What can you do to prevent ember build-up or prevent the adverse effect of ember build-up on timber window sills, say with single glazed glass?
Protect them with a screen that actually fits flush with the outside of the entire frame. So the screen protects ember entry to the actual timber surface as well. The other one to consider is some novel painting products that provide some degree of combustion protection. Spray systems that are dedicated to spraying on that window itself. Shutters are all reasonable options to pursue.
Screen sounds like a good, it does not relying on anything else other than the screen itself, which it kind of appeals a bit.
And a few side benefits like the debris impact protection and a bit of radiant heat protection from your plain glass windows and a few other things.
Yeah. Here's another question really about windows. How can we do our best in a do-it-yourself window protection at a more affordable price than roller shutters? If we don't consider heat flux the main vector of threat, will steel mesh be the best for protecting against branches and debris?
Yeah, so a steel mesh system offers you quite good radiant heat protection, and a good rule of thumb is that if you look at the mesh you're possibly going to use, it'll have a shade rating, which is the amount of light filtering it offers. So if, let's say it's a 50% shade rating, that actually means that it halves the radiant heat or filters out 50% of the radiant heat that's trying to get through it to your window glass. So it does provide a significant amount of protection. You can get higher rated and lower rated shade ratings than that. The critical thing though with installing mesh screens is that obviously the pore size has to be smaller than 2 mil to offer some ember protection, but the framing that it's secured to needs to be metal as well, and the means that it's joined to that frame needs to be metal. So some of the really common cheap framing systems that have a push-in polymer bead to secure them just simply don't hold up in a bushfire because that polymer bead melts out when any degree of radiant heat's applied to them. So you need to move on to some type of crimping or some better secured screen system. And they're definitely around if you look hard enough, and you can get some sort of DIY framing frames and mesh systems.
Thanks, Justin. I've got one here. This is really a commentary on me, but I think it could apply to some people. In 2009, when our home in Strathewen was threatened, I thought I was reasonably well prepared. I'd made and it relates to what you said early on, I'd mowed the grass down to the dirt, There wasn't a lot of bushes nearby, and um, I had no idea of what it would really be like in that sort of sandstorm of embers that just keeps coming and coming and coming. I was imagining being outside and going around and putting out spot fires for some reason. I guess lots of people did. And one of the things I discovered pretty quickly was I actually needed a team of people. I watched the fire move slowly towards a shed and burn $100,000 worth of tractors, but I couldn't leave the house because, you know, that was the thing that I wanted to protect the most. And then when that failed, my water pipe failed. Of course, the house was lost. So I was naive, but I guess one of the things that came back to me was I had focused on putting out fires rather than what you've been talking about, which is stopping them from starting. And I suspect that there's a lot of people around like me who start to think about having lots of water and lots of hoses, and yes, you can find yourself in trouble pretty quickly.
Yeah, we certainly find that houses with one active adult looking after them certainly has one level of likelihood of survival, but you go and add 2 or 3 adults to that house and its prospect of survival more than doubles and triples. And it's simply because of that not enough hands prospect. And I guess that is a really important aspect, is you're going to have simultaneous ignitions and processes unfolding, and the question is, can you recognize them early enough and get to all of them quick enough in a safe way for that to be the case? So elimination and passive is the golden rule, and that's the best way also to be able to confidently leave your house in a bushfire event and feel confident that it's going to be there when you get back. You know, an ideal house is one that just doesn't need you helping it.
We've got one more question here, and then I think our time's up. Can the upslope be protected by landscaping and planting trees and shrubs that provide a potential slowing effect on the fire?
Yeah, most definitely. And not just a slowing effect, but actually a significant radiant heat barrier between you and the active fire that's coming up the slope. So if you remove, like following the 1030 and the 1050 rule, if you remove all the surface fire and have either, you know, a green lawn under tree canopy or low flammability plantings, the trees and the tree trunks will offer you radiant heat protection from that fire that's further back. And that's actually in virtually all cases much better than having complete clearance between you and that unmanaged bush that's at the 30 or the 50 metre mark. So strategic planning of low flammability plants and established canopy trees are a really good asset to have between you and the fire.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you, Justin, once again for laying out some really practical options for us and some you know, detailed information that'll help us, and once again easily digestible and really clear. And thank you too for responding again to so many questions. And we haven't found one you can't answer, which is pretty impressive too. I'd like to let people know that our third bushfire webinar will take place next Tuesday, November 10th at 7:30. And this time we'll be focusing on getting your insurance right. In this session, you're going to hear from a panel of insurance representatives and a consumer lawyer. And you've got a few days before then to go away and read your insurance policy and draft up some questions. When you leave tonight's webinar, you'll automatically receive a short questionnaire designed to assist us with making improvements. So please respond to that promptly. We really do want to get that feedback. Once again, I'd like to acknowledge Max Garner, Neil Marshall, Alan Bloom and Mark Gravel of the Bushfire Resilience Incorporated for their commitment in conducting this webinar series. And special thanks to CFA District 14 HQ for their support in providing the webinar platform, and especially the technical assistance provided by Rowan Thornton, which has been outstanding. Finally, our Bendigo Bank community bank branches have sponsored this series because the topics are fundamental to the safety and well-being of our community. If you're looking at your banking or insurance needs, please give one of our local branches in Hurstbridge, Diamond Creek, Eltham, Doreen or Kinglake the opportunity to quote. Call in or give the branch a call. You'll find the Bendigo Bank products are high quality and very competitive. Thank you and good night.